PUBG Update 41.2 changed rendering paths and texture streaming. Here's the new optimal setting stack for competitive frames per second in May 2026. Update 41.2 introduced three back-end changes that ripple through settings choices. First, the deferred renderer now batches shadow cascades differently. Shadow quality settings moved from a CPU side bottleneck to a GPU geometry load. Second, texture streaming got a new priority scheduler that front-loads high MIP textures when VRAM headroom exists, making the texture slider behave less like a VRAM gate and more like a quality toggle. Third, the anti-aliasing pass shifted from post-resolve to in-lighting, which reduces the cost of TAA at 1440p and above, but increases the overhead of MSAA combinations that almost no one uses anyway. The net effect: shadow settings are cheaper on modern GPUs with strong. This stack targets 144 plus frames per second at 1080p or 1440p on mid to high-end hardware, RTX 4060, RX 7700 EXT, and up. Measured benchmarks from PC-optimized settings show an RTX 4060 hitting 200 frames per second average at 1080p competitive and 144 frames per second average at 1440p competitive, while an RTX 3060 Ti matches those same targets. An RTX 4080 Super pushes 305 frames per second average at 1080p Ultra and 212 frames per second average at 1440p Ultra, confirming there's overhead to scale if you have the GPU for it. Overall quality preset. Custom, ignore the presets. They bundle anti-competitive visibility settings. Screen scale, 100. Anything below 100 is render resolution downscaling. Only touch this if not every GPU should run the same stack. Here's where to deviate based on your hardware class as of 2026. RTX 4060, RX 7600, ARC B580. Textures, medium. Effects, very low. Shadows, low. You're trading the lighting pass stutter risk for raw frame budget. Screen scale can drop to 90 if you're consistently below 100 frames per second. Visibility loss is real, but preferable to 80 frames per second with hitches. The 8GB VRAM ceiling is a hard constraint in 2026. PUBG's high MIP texture set after 41.2 will spike to 9.2 GB at textures high even at 1080p, causing stutter as the OS pages to system RAM. RTX 4070, RX 7700 EXT, ARC B770. PUBG is still a quad-core primary engine. It spreads work across more cores, but the main thread and render thread dominate frame time. If you're on a 6-core or 8-core CPU without 3D V-Cache, non-X3D Ryzen, Intel Core Ultra 200S, you'll see better frame pacing by disabling SMT/hyperthreading in BIOS. This sounds backwards, but the scheduler overhead of maintaining 12 or 16 logical threads while only 4 are hot causes micro-stutter. An 8-core chip running 8 threads can deliver smoother 0.1% lows than the same chip running 16 threads in PUBG after update 41.2. On AMD X3D chips, Ryzen 7 9800 X3D, 7800 X3D, leave SMT on, the large L3 cache. Update 41.2 deprecated the old SM4 and low memory launch options. They now do nothing and can cause startup errors. The only launch option worth using in 2026 is refresh rate, to force your monitor's max refresh if the game auto-detects it wrong. Right-click PUBG in Steam, Properties, Launch Options, enter Refresh 240 if you have a 240Hz panel. For config file tweaks, the relevant file is GameUserSettings.ini in %localappdata Persil TSL game Persil saved config Bursal Windows client. Two settings changed behavior in 41.2. SG. Resolution quality controls screen scale. Verify it's set to 100.000000 unless you intentionally lowered it. And SG. View distance quality should be 3 for ultra view distance. The game will reset these to defaults if you updated to 41.2 and your frames per second tanked or stutter appeared that wasn't there in 41.1, the culprit is usually one of 3 things. First, shader cache corruption. NVIDIA and AMD both recompile shaders when the rendering pipeline changes. Delete the shader cache folder at %local app data /tsl game /saved /shader cache and let the game rebuild it on the next launch. Expect a 2 to 3 minute stutter fest the first match while it compiles. Then, smooth sailing. Second, the new texture streaming scheduler can thrash if your page file is undersized. Windows 11 defaults to a tiny, auto-managed page file on systems with 32 GB plus RAM, assuming you don't need it. PUBG's 41.2 streaming logic uses the point update 41.2 shifted enough under the hood that the old set everything to very low and call it done approach no longer holds. The new rendering pipeline rewards a more nuanced stack. Medium shadows, low effects, high textures if you have the VRAM. The gains are measurable. Players on RTX 4060 class hardware report going from 140 to 150 frames per second average in April to 180 to 200 frames per second average in May with the updated stack, a 30% lift for free. If you want a zero guesswork config tailored to your exact hardware, generate a free playbook at /optimize. It pulls your GPU, CPU specs, cross-references them against measured benchmarks for PUBG specifically, and outputs a settings. Build your free playbook for any GPU at betterfps.com/optimize.